The Stocking Strangler is a chapter in Columbus history that's gotten a lot of attention. We're now going to talk to the man who prosecuted it and the man who's told his story.
You speak, we listen. Conversations connecting people. This is the Chuck Williams Show.
Thanks for joining us for this edition of the Chuck Williams Show. We'll get right to it. We got two guests today, and we're going to talk about the most horrific 10, 12-month period in the history of Columbus, Georgia. We're going to talk about the Stocking Stranglers with two subject matter experts. First, we got Judge Bill Smith. Judge Smith was a district attorney that prosecuted Carlton Gary that later led to his execution. And then we got William Rawlings. He is the author out of Sandersville, Georgia, who told Judge Smith's story. Gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
I'll start with you, Mr. Rawlings. You have written a book that many people I've known over the years, including myself, would have loved to have written. How did you get Judge Smith's story and get this book?
Well, this story centers around two things. One is, of course, the killer and the horrific series of crimes that he committed. And the other major part of the story was bringing this killer to justice and his interaction with the judicial system, which is, of course, the story of Judge Bill Smith, who was the prosecutor at that time. It's a fascinating tale, one of these ones that as a writer you look for. It's not simply a 1, 2, 3, 4. It has twists and turns and strange things. It's just absolutely an interesting thing. And also it's quite complicated, too. It's a story that
Incredibly complicated.
Incredibly complicated, correct. And if you really look at the entire picture, the story spans nearly half a century. So there was a lot of horrible things that happened here in the late 1970s in Columbus. The trial was in the 1980s, and the appeals lasted 32 years beyond the trial.
The execution was in 2018.
That's correct. In March 2018, 32 years after Carlton Gary's conviction, he was executed by the state of Georgia.
Judge Smith, you knew this story better than anyone because you lived it. You lived the time the killings were happening. Then 6 years later, when Carlton Gary was arrested and tried, you were the guy who tried him. You were the man that sat there across the table or in the table next to him. Why have you waited until now to tell your side of this story?
Well, first of all, it's not really a book about me. It's a book about the Columbus. It's a book about the case and what have you. I just happened to draw the short straw and be the guy in the position that had to try the case. And my obligation as district attorney, and I did the best that I could. But to more specifically answer your question, because I was prohibited from telling it for a long period of time, for the couple of years after the trial, I did make some speeches about it and tell people, clubs and groups and what have you about it. But when I became a judge, I got locked down by the judicial canons of ethics. I say locked down, that may be a harsh term, but I was prohibited. And even though I was a senior judge after I retired, that still continued. I was bound by the judicial canons of ethics, and so until the conclusion of the case, the execution, if you will, I was prohibited from speaking publicly about the case and the story.
Mr. Rawlings, how did this story find you? You've written one true crime story. You've written 12 books. You publish a lot out of Mercer Press. How did this story find you?
Well, two things. One is that I had recently written a book about another horrific South Georgia murder, which had come out a couple of years earlier. Two is I'm a Southern writer. I think that's the best way to describe me. I've written both fiction and nonfiction as well as Southern history. This book is, in essence, a historical document, or at least I tried to make it that. It's the story without editorial commentary of a horrific period in Columbus and, in fact, the state's history. The short answer is my publisher asked me to consider writing the book. I took one look at it and said, yes, I'll do it.
Didn't take long on this one with your background, did it?
Well, it should have taken long. This is a tremendously.
I mean, it didn't take long for you to jump into it. I mean, this is what people that do what you do for a living dream about.
It took me a very short period of time to say yes. Of course, I'd love to do this story, but I should say that this is a very, very complicated book. It was a very complicated book to write. I had to review between 15 and 20,000 pages of transcripts and other records. I had to interview dozens of people. There were decades of newspaper articles and so forth and so on. And then you had to put it in perspective and put it together in a cogent story that readers would appreciate and enjoy and follow despite its complexity.
And make it accurate.
Right. It had to be accurate because in the past there's been a lot of misinformation about this saga, and my job as a writer and as a documenter of history is to tell the story truthfully and straight without my opinion.
Well, I have not had a chance to read it. It's a hard book to get in Columbus right now, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But I want to go to Judge Smith, and I want him to paint a picture for me. Paint a picture of 1977-78. In Columbus, Georgia, and what happened, what was going on that led to these events,
Well, anyone who lived through that and was of age will never never forget what happened. Everyone has a story about remembering the events, hearing about a particular victim. It's the drones of the helicopters over your house, the police coming by at night, shining spotlights into your windows and casting shadows, being stopped while walking your dog in the evenings. It was a time of Columbus, as you phrased it earlier, has never had anything like it. I guess we didn't know how to react, and to have a serial murderer among us in our midst was just unprecedented.
We did have a serial killer. We had 7 women. What was the common denominator between the victims?
Well, the police certainly looked for the common denominator. The common denominator was the area of Columbus that they lived in. It was at that time called Winton. It's now more fashionably called Midtown, I suppose. But generally in a small area within Winton, with one exception, the last victim, Ms. Kofer, was outside of this. And my theory on that is that it just became so saturated with police that he had to move outside, and he did for the last victim. She was at the intersection, more or less, of University Road and City Mill Road, her home. But the police looked for other common denominators, and rightfully so. This was a logical way to investigate the case, a common yard service, a common beauty shop, a common grocery store, and they could not find him. There was no other one other than that, but it was the right way to investigate the case.
So it was elderly women, and the way I've heard it described before is if you took Dinglewood Pharmacy and drew about a mile circle around Dinglewood Pharmacy, you would pretty much cover the area that was impacted. That's
an accurate way to describe it.
All of the women were elderly. What were the age ranges?
The youngest was 59. oldest was 89. Mrs. Florence Scheibel, and you talked about the brutality of it, which is a necessary part of the book. He just simply had to describe it as an example. Mrs. Scheibel, the 89-year-old, was, in addition to being raped and strangled to death, she was brutally bitten and beaten, and her neck was broken.
I read an interview you did in advance of this, Mr. Rawlings, where you said you were, moved's not the right word, but you were incredibly impacted by what happened to Ms. Scheibel.
Yes, Ms. Scheibel was 10 days short of her 90th birthday. She was nearly deaf. She was nearly blind. She was on a walker. She was the most pitiful and defenseless of all the victims, and yet this person was brutally abused prior to her death. And it's really a horrific thing. And you begin to say, what sort of person, what sort of animal would do this to this poor lady? And it does move you. And of course, I did a lot of research, which included looking at the police reports and actually looking at the crime scene photos, which were absolutely horrific. So there's a lot that was just too horrible to even put in the book. But you can't help but having seen it, it certainly moves you.
And some of the victims, a lot of the victims, were a who's who list of Columbus, right, Judge?
Yes, they certainly were, and that was part of a theory as to why he was attacking them or what have you. But a number of them were middle-class folks, school teachers, a health department worker, but certainly you're right. A number of them were names that one would find in Columbus history and very, very prominent.
So these crimes happened in late 77, early 78, and then they just all of a sudden stopped. Boom. 7 victims. After Miss Kofer was the last one you said. After Miss Kofer's death, it just ended. I mean, but the investigation didn't, right?
That's exactly right. And of course, the people of Columbus had no idea that Miss Kofer would be the last. They expected another one. After all, there'd been 7 in an 8-month period. And
so were they still living in fear?
Yeah, they were. And those who were living here, some of the what I now call elderly. At that time, my definition of elderly has changed since I was 34 years old when the crime was committed, and 43 when I prosecuted the case. But some of them moved out of town. Some of them moved in with other relatives. Some of them moved in with each other, thinking that would afford some protection.
But you had sons living with their moms just out of protection of that, right? I mean,
well, and you also had moms living with their sons. For instance, my mother was a widow at that time. We lived in the Target area, and she came to live with us and stayed for 2 years. So, yes, every precaution was taken, including the sale of locks, burglar bars, guns that you can imagine to protect themselves. We did not have, and I would emphasize this, the sophisticated burglar alarms that we have now. If they had, everyone in the area would have had one, or most everyone, I'm confident.
When you ride through Overlook or ride through the Midtown area, the neighborhoods with these houses, you can see remnants of that era now because you can see those burglar bars on those windows. I mean, that's one of the things that strikes me, kind of having been here for a while, is you ride through there and, you know, those burglar bars are a reminder of the terror and the horror, right?
Well, that's true, and I personally never ride by one of the houses. Well, it was murder there, or whether it was simply a burglary there that he committed without recalling it. And I was born and raised and grew up in the area, attended the grade school and high school in the area, and so it was my home base, and it still is, always will be. But I never go by a house that I don't recall exactly what happened there.
I'm going to get to you in just a second, Mr. Ross, but I want to ask one question. I sort of had this in my head since this podcast started, before doing the prep work. You came out of Auburn University, and you became a member of the FBI. Then you came home, went to work in the DA's office. In the DA's office of that era, you see a DA's office now with 29 attorneys. It was, 3 of y'all then, right?
Well, actually, at one time, it was only one. I was the second assistant hired. Hardy Pollis, who became the city attorney, was there. And Hardy left to go to the city attorney's office as an assistant, so I became the chief assistant district attorney. The only problem was I was not only the chief assistant, I was the only assistant. And there were no other assistants to be the chief of.
And Judge Wisn't was the DA, right?
That's correct.
But the question I want to ask is, you had FBI experience. You had come up through the ranks, what they were at the DA's office, and then later became a judge. But do you think there were things in your life growing up in that area, going to the FBI Academy, the DA stuff, that when Carlton Gary was captured and the wheels of justice started to turn, that you were uniquely situated to be the man who represented our community?
Well, I phrased it a few minutes ago that I drew the short straw.
And I don't think that's right. I think that you're underselling yourself.
Well, you could say that. The answer to your question is yes. Everything that I had done prepared me for this moment. My 14 weeks in the FBI Academy, studying a week long on fingerprints, investigative techniques, certainly assisted me. My service as an agent, nothing could have been better for me. I didn't know that at the time. That wasn't the reason I was doing it. For 7 years, I served as an assistant district attorney. I had tried, I'm sure, a half dozen or more capital cases, that is, death penalty cases. But I don't want to emphasize me or my story. I had tremendous help and assistance.
Oh, I mean, you can lay it off the names. I mean, you had, on the police side, you had Ricky Board, Charlie Rowe, Mike Sellers. What was the attorney that assisted you through most?
Doug Pullen, who was my chief assistant, and I pulled away from all the work that I could in the district attorney's office from the time of the arrest through the time of trial. Doug pulled away from his regular work. We had 3 investigators. Who
was the lead investigator?
A guy named Al Miller, who's 96 years old and going strong, driving. I visited with him, gave him a copy of the book last week. And in any event, we had 3 investigators. He pulled off of all the work that he was doing for those 2 years, and we had a total of 5 assistants by this time. But the chief assistant and myself and Al pulled off. You've already mentioned the 3 detectives from the police department. They were kind enough to let me have a thought for a few months, and it ended up being 2 years. So I had a tremendous amount of assistance.
Did you talk to Mr. Miller, Mr. Rawlings? Were you able to talk to?
I don't believe I did. No.
You did talk to Chief Warren. You did talk to a number of the police officers. You have written. You call yourself a Southern writer, and I think that's in literary terms, that's an art form. As a Southern writer, this is a Southern story. What prepared you to tell it?
I don't know the exact answer to that question because writing, if you really try to make a go of it as a writer, as someone who produces books and stories, you have to have a feel for the situation. If you grow up in the South with all the exigencies of our particular part of the country, our accents and our problems and our past and the
Our idiosyncrasies.
Idiosyncrasies, let's use that word. That's a great one. You sort of focus on those. This book in particular, that I wrote, this account that I should say, in the first chapter of the book, I give a history of Columbus because there were several things in this story that became quite important. The issue of race was a major issue that permeates the entire story. And so during the decades prior to this situation, these killings, there were things that might make one believe that the person that was eventually accused might not get a fair trial, but that's not the case. He was afforded every opportunity to defend himself and had excellent defense attorneys.
If you may allow me, I'd like to read the first sentence of your book.
Sure.
This is the settlement on the frontier is how you started. You're talking about that history of Columbus. The city of Columbus, Georgia is unique for many reasons, not the least among them being the fact that the land on which it was founded was acquired by treachery and paid for in blood. That's a pretty powerful sentence, and it describes this community and who it was taken from very well.
Well, it does, but you have to remember it's a historical description. We all have a history on us, one way or the other, including this community. And I go on to explain this about the interaction with Native Americans and other things that happened, because events today don't exist in an isolated world. They are the continuations of things that happened earlier, and the attitudes and the biases and the perceptions and misconceptions of things that happened in the past color our thinking currently in all things, not this story, but everything we do.
The past is important to a writer, but also to the story. And it's interesting. About 10 years ago, I found myself in Halifax on a cruise and got off the boat in Halifax. And it reminded me a little bit of Columbus, a bigger Columbus. But then you started hearing the tortured history of Halifax. That's where they brought the Titanic survivors. The morgue was put in place. It was the largest explosion in the harbor there, a dynamite explosion that killed over 2,500 people on a British ship. I mean, you see this beautiful place, but there's also this tortured history. Did you feel you had a responsibility to talk about some of the history, the race, and some of the torture, the Civil War, some of the torture that is Columbus's history?
I think that the interpretation of this series of horrific events did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred in a community, a living, breathing community with a long history. And so when something horrific occurs like this, people look at it in the context of what came before. There have been other accounts written of this story that somehow harked back to things that happened 100, 150 years earlier, which I personally did not support. I don't think it's fair to...
You're talking about Mr. Rose's book.
I am, but I don't think it's fair to visit the sins of the fathers upon their sons. And this has been part of the controversy about Mr. Rose's book and other things. And so, in other words, this didn't occur in an isolated environment. It occurred in a context. And I tried to put the story in context, which I think is important when you're a writer, trying to document something, not trying to form an opinion, but rather document a horrific series of events, as I said.
You did. I mean, I can't wait to read it. I can't wait. Judge Smith, I want to switch back to you, sir. When was the first time you heard the name Carlton Gary?
First time I heard the name, and it was after roughly 10,000 pages of police reports on this case that had already been done without his name ever being mentioned in them. It was from Chief Wetherington. He was chief of police at the time, later became mayor. And he called me to tell me that the department had developed a suspect, and he felt that it was a good suspect. Now, there'd been hundreds, if not thousands of them already before that.
How long after, when did the 3, 4, 5, 6 years?
6 years passed between the last murder. We've already mentioned Mrs. Cofer, and the development of Gary as a suspect. And it was in one of the last days of April of 1984. He gave me the name. He told me very briefly some of the evidence that had developed about him. I had never heard the name. The chief had never heard the name. As I say, his name had never been mentioned in a police report before that.
Where was he?
He was back in Columbus. He had escaped from the penitentiary in South Carolina at that time. There are a number of escapes in his past that the book sets out very well. But this time he was in a state penitentiary in Columbia, South Carolina, and for numerous armed robbery charges, primarily in Greenville, South Carolina. But the one he was arrested on was in a small town of Gaffney, about 50 miles north of Greenville on Interstate 85. And he'd been serving there since 1979, and he escaped. He returned to Columbus and was back in the Columbus area when he was developed as a suspect. He'd been back about 3 weeks, apparently, from the time of his escape till he returned here. Obviously, there was an intense effort to arrest him, which is, again, well described in the book. But the chief had a dilemma, and he discussed that with me. He said he's already a fugitive. He's already an escapee. So he obviously would know that he was being sought by law enforcement, although it was a relatively low priority.
To be sent back to South Carolina.
That's correct. And we have now developed him as a certainly viable and suspect in the strangling cases. Should we go public and tell the people that we have a suspect in the Strangler cases, and drive Gary further underground? Or should we not go public and not tell them, have a better chance of arresting him, but possibly have him not commit another murder during this time?
Man, that's not a dilemma. That's a moral dilemma.
Well, it was a tough decision, and I don't take credit for what he did. It was the chief's decision, but we discussed it at the time, and he made the decision not to tell the public.
He never committed another crime.
Another crime. Fortunately, he was arrested in about a week after that. I say another crime. He was committing many crimes during this time, other armed robberies. He was involved in drug dealing, even though he'd only been out for 3 weeks out of the penitentiary. But fortunately, he never committed another murder, and he was arrested in Albany, Georgia, through the work that our department did in the Holiday Inn in Albany, May the 3rd, I believe, of 1984, about a week after I was informed by the chief of the circumstances.
When did you become convinced as the prosecutor he wasn't a suspect, he was a killer?
Well, as I said, I got a brief description from Chief Weatherington and followed in the days immediately after that with some of the circumstances. We knew from the facts that he gave me, though, that he was the strangler. His fingerprint had been identified at the point of entry on a screen at the point of entry of the Woodruff burglary and murder. This print had been lifted, if you know anything about latent fingerprints, from a screen that was removed from the window that the burglar entered. This print had been retained in the Columbus Police Department, and not only that, it had been circulated to law enforcement agencies throughout the state and throughout the region. And everyone was asked to compare this print with any possible suspect or non-suspect alike and notify the department, obviously, if you got a hit. At that time, there was no computer that you simply
No database.
Sent your print into, and you get back a name and serial number, date of birth, etc. of the individual. You had to have a full set of the fingerprints of the suspect, and then compare one by one that print of the suspect. And so that's what they had been doing. For the first year or so after the last murder, every individual who came through the Columbus Police Department print was compared. Obviously, they never got a hit, but they did acquire the full set of prints of Gary from the penitentiary in South Carolina where he had been, and that's why they stopped, by the way. The murder stopped. He was arrested on an armed robbery, and Gaffney went to the penitentiary in South Carolina. Well, that's why ours stopped a few months after the less than a year.
If that hadn't happened, do you think he would have continued? Mr. Rawlings is shaking his head over here.
I'm not an expert on serial murders, but I'll let you answer that.
There's no way of knowing, but it's in writing about this series of events, it's hard not to get a real feel and to almost have the impression that you know this person. Yes, I think the problems would have continued, including the murders. This man was a armed robber. He was a rapist. He was a vicious individual, a vicious sociopath, but a very intelligent, vicious sociopath.
Incredible charisma.
Oh, yes. He was narcissistic, to say the least, and was a con man. I think people that were convinced of his innocence. He during the entire episode, he never ever admitted personally that he was culpable for these particular murders, and he was so convincing that he would look you straight in the eye and say, "Of course I didn't do that. I wouldn't sit here and tell you that I did. That I wouldn't lie to you."
And he built quite an army of defenders.
He built quite an army of defenders, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. We're all welcome to our opinion, but in the end, we want justice to be served based not on opinion, not on emotion, but rather on hard evidence. And Judge Smith and the other prosecutorial team, and in fact the entire justice system, looked at this in great detail. And despite his detractors, despite the detractors of the eventual verdict, I believe that it was correct, and I believe that it was certainly confirmed by the fact that it went through the entire judicial system up to the U.S. Supreme Court on 4 separate occasions.
But he wasn't convicted for all 7. He was only convicted for 3 of the murders, right? Why is that, Judge?
That's correct. Well,
that's one of the things his people talk about.
Well, that's certainly a legitimate question. I'd like to go back to the previous question that you asked, though, and add that when his fingerprint was found to match the entry into the Woodruff home, his fingerprint also was found to match latent fingerprints found in 3 of the other victims' homes. So his personal fingerprint was found in 4 of the 7 murders, victims' homes.
What were the 4?
They were
Woodruff, obviously.
Woodruff, Thurman, the Scheibel, and Jackson.
Okay.
But which leads me to answer your question that you just asked. Why 3? Why not 7? Well, you may recall that another horrendous case was in the news at that time. That was the Atlanta child murders.
Yep.
I think he was only convicted of 1 or 2, even though he apparently did many more than that. And I picked the 3 strongest cases we had and prosecuted him on those, Scheibel, Thurman, and Woodruff. There we had his fingerprint in each of the homes, and we had his admission or confession that he participated in those cases. With the other 4, we either had only his print or we had his admission. But in these 3, we had both. And I picked those 3. I was taught to lead with strength. We did. We were able to bring in, though, under our law, they're called similar acts, and I don't want to get tangled in legalese.
You couldn't bring them in today. The law's changed, right?
Yeah, no, we could.
Okay.
We could, and we brought in all 4. The jury heard of all 7 of the murders, including the 4 he was not charged with. We brought in a murder that he was initially charged with and pled to a lesser offense in Albany, New York, when he was 19. He committed when he was 19 years old. We brought in a rape and attempted murder by strangulation of a lady in Syracuse, New York, that he'd done prior to this, that he always blamed someone else for the crime.
So he fits the very definition of serial killer.
Oh, yes. And also there were other burglaries and attempted murders here in Columbus that we were able to bring in under this theory of evidence that's well recognized. It's not unique to this case. I did the same thing in the Wayne Williams case, child murders case in Atlanta.
Okay, yeah. You don't have to ask, may I? Come on right on in. You're an expert too, Mr. Rawlings.
No, I'm scarcely an expert on anything. But the legal concept here is a difficult one, and to the average reader, myself included, probably who's not an attorney, the details of the fact that you can bring in similar acts were explained in with some care in the book, so the reader can understand why evidence from other cases with which he was not charged were allowed at trial. And this is
and that's part of making sure this document stands a historical test, right?
It is, but it's also part of allowing the reader to understand the story. This is a horribly complex story, as I said, and you want the reader to go through it very much like the judiciary and the police went through it. So this is a sequentially written story that tries to address and explain difficult concepts.
You've used the terms complex and complicated a couple of times this morning or today. When you started looking at it as a writer, as somebody who was charged with telling the story, who didn't live it, what was the most complicated part of the story to you?
There were 7 murders, each of which was complicated, complex. But after a while, they began to display a pattern, which was part of the part of the evidence that was presented at trial. And then also there were complications, and I say bizarre complications of bizarre events. For example, there was a second serial killer operating in Columbus during the same period of time, the so-called Forces of Evil serial killer.
Was that down on Fort Benning or down? I'm
Right.
trying to.
Right, it was.
South Columbus. One of the victims was found on Fort Benning,
Okay.
But this person, who's William Henry Hance, was eventually convicted and sentenced to death. This person was trying to convince the Columbus police that he was in fact doing his murders in retribution for the police not solving the Strangler murders. It's horribly bizarre. There were other things. There were the Ku Klux Klan got into the picture at one time, wanting to. It was rumored, or actually established early, that the killer was African American, and therefore the Klan stepped up, which was horrific. Opposed by most rational individuals, but they have their rights.
I came into this. I was in Eufaula. I remember it as a kid or a high school kid back at the time. But when you look at this now, when I came into this story, Carlton Gary was almost a rock star defendant or a rock star person in the justice system. I mean, you would go to cover, and I only covered 2 or 3 hearings, but you would have these people that were there just to be near Carlton Gary. I always found that incredibly bizarre, Judge. I mean, what does that speak to what Mr. Rawlings was talking about a few minutes ago?
Well, I suppose so. But it's not unusual, from what I understand about high-profile killers and serial killers, to attract this following. In the book, you'll find that he married a lady from, I'm not sure where she was from, actually, but married her while he was on death row. And she would support him. She was there giving interviews to the press. Of course, she'd not even known him during the time of the crime. So he corresponded with people in England, corresponded with people right here in Columbus. You'll find in the book. It's certainly not unprecedented for them to develop a group of followers and true believers.
You also had Ted Bundy operating about this time in Florida, Tallahassee, in that area. So, I mean, this area was ripe with serial killers, and I know that I don't say that lightly. I mean, they were all over the place: Atlanta, Tallahassee, Columbus. Why is that?
That's correct, and William has done a good job of describing other books on this subject and on this case, and you've referred to them. One of them is that Ted Bundy committed at least a part of these murders. Totally unrealistic. A 400-page book, self-published book by a guy who's nationally known, not as an author, but as a national comedian who's from Columbus, called Happy New Year Ted, trying to convince people that not these 3 murders, but that the murders after New Year, after January 1st of 78, were committed by Ted Bundy. So it's attracted a lot of theorists, a lot of writers in the past, but I am so glad to have the truth told in just following the facts, citing sources without opinions.
I'm going to ask the mother of all hypothetical questions, and I'd like for both of y'all to weigh in. This obviously happened in the late 70s. Could you imagine Columbus today with a Stocking Strangler on the loose, with social media and with everything that is out there? I mean, there was no social media. There was the rumor mill. The rumor mill was running rich with all of the stuff during the Stocking Stranglings, but you didn't have the mass communication that you do today. What would it be like if this were happening now? Start with you, Judge.
I can only imagine. But I would also add that during the trial, the preparation for trial, the 2 years between arrest and the actual trial, we had, and the trial itself in 1986, we had no social media then. I am so grateful that that's the case now. It was covered by traditional media. The television stations filmed every moment of the trial. Of course, only excerpts ran, but they had one common camera in there, and it was thoroughly covered. We had, I believe, 2 newspapers at that time, the Ledger and the Inquirer, and they did a very good job of covering the case also. But I personally am grateful that during the trial time we had no social media. Now, I would emphasize this, and it's something you be aware of, that there was a change of venue. And the jury was selected from another county. Judge Fallowell, who presided in the trial and did a very good job under some very challenging and difficult circumstances, again, that are described in the book. When he granted the change of venue, granted it to Spalding County. But this was the first time.
That's Griffin, right?
Griffin is the county seat, correct. And it was the first time under some new Superior Court rules that the jury could be brought back to the county where the case originated, or where venue originally was lied. And so these 12 jurors and 4 alternates were selected after a 2-week jury selection process in Griffin. They were put on a bus, brought to Columbus, put in what was at that time the Hilton Hotel, sequestered from news, television, newspapers.
They had their own floor, didn't they?
They did. So that was the first time that a jury was allowed to be brought back to the county. If we'd had to try this in Griffin, it would have over 100 witnesses were called, and to transport them to Griffin, many of them family members of the deceased who had to identify various things and testify were older. We had 2 witnesses testify from wheelchairs and one from a hospital bed brought in.
Did you have any who had deceased that you had to use their video testimony?
No, we didn't do that. Fortunately, Colonel Scheibel, the son of Mrs. Scheibel, who died he discovered his mother's body, and he passed away between the time of the crime and the time of the arrest. But his son was able to testify and fill in that gap, fortunately. But it's amazing, really, that we had that many that we were able to, who survived during that time.
Let me ask you this. When, in 1986, when that jury convicted him and then ultimately sentenced Carlton Gary to death, that was not the end of the story. In many ways, it was just the beginning of the story. I'll let Mr. Rawlings start with that. As a storyteller, there's a natural break there from everything to the conviction, but then there's a whole nother story after the conviction.
There was, and when I first, when I first looked at this story, I thought this would be a fairly short section. The book, just in terms of writing, was divided into 3 sections. One was the part that describes the killing. The second part describes the time between Gary's arrest and his conviction. And the third part, which I called 32 years, is the time between Gary's conviction and his eventual execution. in my initial thoughts, this will be perhaps a chapter or two. And as it turned out, it's a fairly long section of the book, and there were lots of things that happened. The defense attorneys, which were a very good and hardworking group, their job was to get this man proved innocent if possible, but they were facing overwhelming circumstantial as well as physical evidence that convicted him. They hoped over a period of time by attacking this that they could at least get a new trial, because as time went forward, the witnesses died, people's interest in the case had waned, and so if it's 2010, for example, and you're talking about a series of murders that happened, in the 1970s, I mean, the people on the jury perhaps were not even born at the time. There was lots that happened. There was things that went back and forth, but eventually all of this was upheld, and he was executed.
The defense, you were a judge by the time a lot of this happened, but, you hear the term long game. Carlton Gary's defense was playing a long game, weren't they?
Absolutely, he was, without a doubt.
I think what they were doing, the obligation, if you look at it that way, was to keep him alive. Every day that he was alive after the death sentence was a victory for the defense. And it lasted for 32 years. Frankly, there was a time that I was concerned that I might die before Carlton Gary did, because I'm 8 years older than he is. He was living in a secure, safe environment, whereas I'm driving out here on Veterans Parkway or Victory Drive. I can be killed in an automobile accident. He's not going. He had a physical every year. He had a surgery while he was confined, and I was more subject to death than he was, but I did survive him.
Let me ask you this. You were the man who brought this killer to justice. And are you 100% convinced, Judge Smith, that they executed the right guy?
Well, let me say this, that I was a prosecutor in the district attorney's office for a total of 18 years. I prosecuted hundreds of cases. I never charted them. I never kept up with how many, but a lot of cases. I've already referred to the fact that I prosecuted personally 6 or 8 death penalty cases. This is the strongest case, the greatest amount of evidence of any case that I ever prosecuted or was prosecuted by someone else in the district attorney's office during those 18 years. I was absolutely convinced then. I am absolutely convinced now.
I'm going to ask a follow-up to that now, Judge. There are still people in this town that don't think he did it. Legitimate, smart people that don't think he did it. What do you say to the people who don't think Carlton Gary was the Stocking Strangler?
I want William to answer that also, but I would say there's none so blind as he who will not see. I'll turn it over to William.
No, the only thing that I can say is read the book. I try to, as I said earlier, I've tried to present a factual and documented account of this series of things, and it's hard to read the facts without coming to the conclusion this man is guilty. A lot of the detractors of this verdict ask you to prove a negative. For example, they'll say, well, how do you know that, whatever? You can't prove a negative, How do you know that we all shall not die by a meteor coming tomorrow and destroying the world? Well, you don't know that, but you don't think it's going to happen. There was an interview I saw recently about a podcast, about an interview I did. Someone had asked one of the defense attorneys. And the defense attorney said, well, he's legally guilty, but implying that the system was somehow unfair. I think that that's a red herring. I think that's a distraction from the fact that the evidence is overwhelming and the decision made by the jury and the subsequent appellate courts system was quite accurate and correct.
I've got a dear friend who describes what you just described in a little different way. He said you never play chess with a pigeon, because the pigeon is going to sit there. Eventually, they're going to throw all the boards over, use the bathroom on the board, and fly off and say they won.
It's probably a good analogy.
When you look at this story, Judge Smith, fairly or unfairly, it's going to be in the lead sentence of your obituary, and we hope that's a long time off. But Carlton Gary's name will appear in the first paragraph of your obituary. Are you comfortable with that?
I'm not only comfortable with it, I'm proud of it. I hope it doesn't define me as a person or really as a district attorney or a judge, but it is there. And it's something, as I phrase it, the third time I've said it, I drew the short straw. I didn't seek this case out. I became district attorney in the midst of the crimes. Judge Wisnett was promoted to a judgeship, appointed to a judgeship, and took office on January 4th, 1978. I was sworn in on that same day, January 4th, 1978, as a district attorney. I had been there in the office. I was a chief assistant. I just moved next door to a different office. But it was a trying time, and back to what I said, I'm not only comfortable with it, I'm proud of it.
You were, at the time, you and Louise were raising children. You were a father. You were, kind of this guy in the community. And back then, we didn't talk a lot about mental health or anything. How did you keep your mental health in the middle of this boiling cauldron that you were in?
Well, it was, I'm not sure about my mental health, but it was a challenge to me. In addition to that, I mentioned my mother, a widow, moved in with us in the fall, really before I became the district attorney. And she went back home after 2 years. But when he was arrested and the trial was approaching, she was beginning to develop dementia, so she moved back in with us. During this time, the trial is coming up. We had 2 children at home. My wife was working at this time and teaching, and I just survived. We do what we have to do. It wasn't anything heroic, what have you. I literally tried to do my job the best I could, keep the office going, and prepare to try this case. And I had, again, let me emphasize, tremendous assistance. I certainly don't want to give the impression that I did this alone without Doug pulling.
Somebody's got to be the drum major.
Well, that's the seat I ended up in. That's right.
Mr. Rawlings, I'd like, as we wind this down, I want to ask you a question now. You're from Sandersville. You're a Georgian. We've established a very fine Southern writer. What do you know about Columbus, Georgia now that you didn't know when you started this project?
It's a fine city. In fact, I've sort of fallen in love with Columbus. It's a great place. As much as I dislike larger towns, I live in a small town. Actually, I live on the farm. I am honored to have had such a fine introduction to Columbus. The past, it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily indicative of the present or the future. And as an aside, my daughter is engaged to someone here in town, and she'll be moving to Columbus next July after her wedding. So
how fortuitous!
Yeah, it is.
I will ask you a question that, as a writer myself, I'm often interested in. When do you write your best? Morning, midday, or after, or evening?
Depends on what I'm writing. Actually, I've written both fiction and nonfiction, and when it comes to fiction, I probably do my best in the morning. A lot of people have a tendency to write a little bit one day and review it the next day. I've heard many writers say that. I do the same thing. I read it and write it one day, and the next day I say, "Gosh, this is terrible. I need to rewrite it." But when it comes to doing nonfiction like this, it is like researching a PhD thesis. You really have to get your facts straight. You have to keep meticulous files. You have to be organized. The processes are almost a little bit different, quite a bit different, in fact. So it depends on what I'm writing. If I'm doing nonfiction, to answer your question, I can write 12 hours a day. If I'm doing fiction, I write several hours in the morning.
Interesting. Judge Smith, what was your reaction when you read the first draft of this?
I was pleased. I was grateful that the truth had finally been told. There are 4 or 5, depending on how you count them, previous attempts to tell this story. Each one of them has an agenda. To read a book without an agenda that simply follows the case and follows the facts was the culmination for me. And that's all I've ever wanted. I didn't want it to tell my story. It's such an important part of Columbus's history, especially in the second half of the 20th century, and it needed to be told. And I was afraid that one or more of those other books was going to be the only source that people would have. Now they have the truth. And I was pleased then, and I'm pleased now.
Mr. Rawlings, how does that make you feel as an author to hear what Judge Smith just said?
Simply that I've accomplished my goal to write a truthful book that is consistent with the facts and portrays not only the hard events, but is done so without an opinion or editorial input on the part of the author.
As a journalist, I respect every syllable you just said. I think that is what all of us want, and I can't wait to dig into this. We're at a point now, we've shot over the hour. I think, Judge, you and Dick McMichael are the only 2 have gone into the second hour on a reporter, news anchor here that covered all of this.
It's an honor to be mentioned in the same sentence with Dick.
Absolutely. We're at a point in the podcast now where I call turn the tables. You get to ask me a question, and Judge, you and I have a long relationship that goes back several decades. We share a love for Auburn football. It's a tortured love right now, but it's a love. But I hold you in incredible regard. I've always found you to be honorable, accessible, and truthful. Very curious what you're going to ask.
I'm going to ask what you thought about this case over the years.
A name that hasn't come into this, and I'm going to bring it in now, and Mr. Rawlings will probably jump into this, is Billy Wynn. I always thought Billy was going to be the one that wrote the definitive history of this case. Billy's a son of Columbus, like you, son of that area, like you. And Billy is a former editorial page editor, Ledger, incredibly talented journalist, covered the civil rights movement, did a lot of stuff in the upper end. I always thought Billy was going to be the one. So when I saw somebody else come into it, I was surprised. I thought, okay, what does a guy from Sandersville know about this story? I always thought to tell this story, and I always thought wrongly, I will say this now, to tell this story, you had to have lived it. That there's no way you can channel the emotion of what happened if you weren't in one of those cars that got pulled over randomly on Winnan Road, if you weren't somebody going to your mother's house. I mean, you lived it, and then you prosecute it. I always thought Billy would be the one that told this story, and I think the circumstances ended up going in another direction, and I'd like to hear either one of y'all respond to that.
Let me answer this. Billy Wynn wanted to write the story, and you have to kind of, this is the South. Everybody's related to everybody else. Billy Wynn is my brother's stepfather-in-law at this point. No matter where you live in the South, you're related to somebody.
How come I knew it was going to end up coming back to that?
You shouldn't have asked that question. This book was written with the permission and support of Billy Wynn. Obviously, he intended to write the book. In fact, he told me that he moved back to Columbus in 1978 for the specific purpose of writing this story. And he had accumulated invaluable resources in terms of documentation and so forth and so on.
I saw some of those.
But the problem is the story never ended. The killings were in 77, 78. The case went cold. The arrest was made in 84. The trial was in 86. And then there was 32 years. And so every time you would turn around, there was something new happening. And there were dramatic events, each of these periods of time, including that long 32 years. And in the end, it boiled down to who was going to write the story. With Billy's support and permission, he kindly shared his documents with me, and they contributed extreme amounts.
How valuable was what Billy shared?
It was very valuable because it was the perspective that he had collected documents from the 1970s when the killings took place.
Police and newspaper documents.
Police and newspaper documents, but the police reports were wonderful in terms of telling the story accurately. This is what the police thought at the time. This is what the crime scene looked like. These are people that we interviewed and so forth and so on. Some of that I could have found on my own, and I did do a lot of research in the same area, but stuff that was there was probably would not have otherwise been available.
And it was nice to get in a couple of boxes, right?
Well, I wish it was simply a couple of boxes. It's more like 10 boxes, and I assure you that there's quite a few biker's boxes now that are full of information that I had to collect to write the story. So Billy, this was written with Billy Wynn, and in the book, in the acknowledgments, I certainly give him credit for this.
How old are you, Judge?
I will be 80 years old in 2 weeks. We're having a book signing for William at Dinglewood Pharmacy, as you mentioned, the epicenter of the case, or the center of the case. And Terry Hurley there is kind enough to open on a Sunday afternoon and have William, and people can purchase the book. If they've already bought one, they can come there and have it signed. But that will be my 80th birthday and my 80th birthday celebration. So if anyone wishes to wish me a happy birthday, I'll be standing there doing no more than having a birthday.
Wow, amazing. Here's the book. Here's the cover. And I will close this out with you, Mr. Rawlings, as I hold up your work. It's a hard book to find. I tried everywhere to find it. You're, as an author, you've heard the best words. The first printing's gone, right?
The book has been amazingly successful. The first printing sold through by the date that it was officially released,
which was earlier this month.
It was September 6th. All of the entire first press run was committed and or sold, and so the publishers ordered a second press run. We should have this. There's still some copies. I think we'll have a few copies on the September 25th at Dinglewood, but the book has gotten great reviews, and I've gotten superb feedback from it, and I'm very excited about it. I'm honored to have had the opportunity of writing it, and again, I got to give credit where credit is due. Judge Smith was extremely helpful and has opened many doors for me. Billy Wynn's basic research helped me a lot, and I could give a long list of people, which I do in the book, thanking them for their input and cooperation in writing this very long document.
Well, I am going to sit down and read every word of it, and I'm just, this story, you're a journalist in Columbus and you came along after this story, but you saw parts of it because it played out over a half century, as you said, Judge. The story is just, it's Columbus in every good and bad. Well, our guests have been William Rawlings. He's the author of the Columbus Stocking Strangler. He's the one, a Sandersville, Georgia author who has told the most Columbus of stories. And Judge Bill Smith, who was the man who prosecuted and lived the Stocking Strangler story for a half century of his life. Gentlemen, thank y'all for being here. This has been interesting and special.
Thank you so much
Thanks
for having us.
The Chuck Williams Show airs on Tuesday nights from 7 to 8 on WRBL.com. It's also available on your favorite podcast format, iHeart, Spotify, and Apple. Social media, yeah, we're there too. You can get me on Twitter at Chuck Williams, Facebook, Chuck Williams WRBL, Instagram, Chuck Williams 0999.